6 unfinished sentences. You must fear the desperation of the poor and their subsequent revolts. It is always the rich who are attacked by their murderous hands, and often in their fury they make no distinction between the good and the bad. Olympe de Gouges. The nature is full of unusual assemblies and unsatisfactory sounds. The world is a jigsaw puzzle. The awareness of a human inclination for diversion calls for a new way of enrolling ourselves in ideals that affect the critical conditions of our existence. Humanity's illnesses have to be presented with pure honesty and an acute psychological understanding. Concepts are born, models triumph, hypotheses vary, and legitimacies mutate. Impregnating the universe with wisdom is a daunting task. Psychedelics assist illiterates in puking out monotonous hypotheses in a counterintuitive way. Doctrines generate a chromatic emotional state in poets, far more conflicting than in fiends bent on global evildoing. The Victorian era's scholars were forward-thinking concerning the body of their probes. They were not enthralled by the venture of challenging social pyramids. Their fights for the individual's right of conscience to resolve the accumulated flaws of feudal society lacked the depth to evict mystical beings and incoherence purportedly from their world. A selection of their pieces sliced through their generation's serene pessimisms with disturbing eloquence. Their works, which are still revered to this day, do not tackle the specific political events of the era. All expose the twisted favoritisms of their time. The anti-capitalist movements were rich in exceptional personalities and gutsy ideas. Supporters of political economy theories and skeptics started to pin down the startling link between obsession and confusion. The counter-elites cracked patterns and encryptions that were hidden in political economy psalms, which started to deflate mysticism's influence on the public. There were apostles of the gradual dialectic, the Hegelians' views, who were sure and certain that history was a slow and steady unfolding of human mandate. The libertarian anarchists declared that all property was theft, and sought to disarticulate every joint of the state. The utopian socialist advocated collective ownership of the means of production. The communists fought for the creation of commune or worker cooperatives. Frenetic discussions and writings altered our hyper-awareness in more ways than one. Revolutionaries depicted the church and the state to be a single corrupt institution, which does not act in the best interests of the people. The uncompromising thinkers vowed to pinpoint the forces controlling our sentiments and figure out what makes us human. Little was out of bounds. The analytical assaults on injustice's phlegm and the call for reason in the place of revelation went on to spark rage in the following centuries, in freethinkers all over the globe. The merit of living in a fast-evolving world is that it always contests the resettlement of ideals, from the encephalon into the existent. Idyllic colonists and ruling classes across Europe were shaken by gruesome spectacles of the slaves and the poor, pounding mansions' gates raucously, demanding individual liberty and equality. Fearing the spread of radical ideas, European governments responded by prosecuting hellraisers for seditious libel and treason. Colonial rulers responded without mercy. They razed entire cities to the ground. By and large, the uprising's glitch is in the intelligent faction's failure to overcome prudence at the right time, sniffing the results over their anger. One is left to wonder if this period is a parody of overcoming. It failed to become the age of reason. The bourgeois' robust determination to keep the cliques excluded from the networks of power, from taking the lead to saving the people from exploitation, is not without merit. The faction of a rebellion which is the fiercest and the most responsive to change, or adaptive to the environment, wins it all. The moderate voice's reluctance to be the central part of a theatrical effort prompts ruthless buccaneers to ascend and cleverly bend social dialogue to further their agenda. The smoldered social fairness and public eagerness for drastic changes gives them a giant canvas to splatter on, philosophically. There are a lot of instances when comrades sentenced God to death in their efforts to become divine humans. While God jerked up on the rope, radical thinkers turned society upside down and bloody. The Jacobins were not the last group to be in a war of extermination. They laid in wait on the steps of the palaces and stabbed the owners as they came out. They then proceeded to annihilate their friends and foes. Successful socialist and communist movements have had an intense dislike of dissent. The Bolsheviks used the spontaneous intersection of their thoughts and exposed a hidden face of nature's exquisite beauty to seduce the masses. Their power and vision swelled, as did their apparatus of viciousness. The fact that there are so few characters of color among economics halls of fame inductees doesn't mean the social, commerce and trade and political madhouse is not racially diverse. In Cuba, Fidel Castro latched onto the Soviets under the pretext of seeking assistance in installing a participative culture in which people's voices count regardless of their race or background. He summarily executed the cliques he dethroned, which was celebrated. The dictatorship of the proletariat violently crushed the oppressors, the exploiters and the capitalists, just as they did to their colleagues' defiance. In most minds, the bones of millions of Cambodians are a macabre confirmation that the preeminent dispute of our age, collectivism versus individualism, has been settled. The shepherds and their sheep-like mindsets, twisted in impossibilism and stagism to permanent revolution, led to the death of millions in revolution and counter-insurrection. None of the labor-centric movement philosophers and suzerains ever did manual labor for a living or managed any enterprise. The hardest thing that they did manually before these socio-economic grisly tryouts was writing tracts which announced their ideological dedication. The Victorian succubuses' incomplete hypnotic sermons lured unknowing dupes and psychopaths onto the same dance floor. The suspicion that the whole capitalistic culture is moving towards a catastrophe still subjugates millions to tyrannies, for social justice impersonators have gone too far to preserve their political power, and the abolition of private property has been labeled as silly and irrational. Atrocities committed under the Marxist banner has automatically made capitalism the right fit for humanity. The mere thought of switching from the market economy to any new scheme has become a crime. Under capitalism, man exploits man. Under communism, it's just the opposite. John Kenneth Galbraith. Priceless neurons and time have been squandered in the effort to sort out if poverty is capitalism polydactyly, or the consequence of communism's theoretical oligodactyly. Some conducted an esophago-gastroduodenoscopy on nations to understand wealth and saw an amenable arrangement in wages. Utopian thinkers have always been regarded as Don Quixotes or belletrists by anti-heroes who argue that allocating resources based on need or equality is not fair. They sought to root out all the evils of society by outlawing arrangements between individuals. Is there a clear emotional difference when society chooses not to make any person worse off, and no person should be injured by choices made by the group? Alternatively, what about when each person is responsible for their future, no matter what happens? The 20th century sunk the distributive justice discourse in an abyss of ignorance. Eugenics made the gap in reason and philosophy, where both a logical arrangement and pretexted every human problem non-existent. It could well be defined by crusades to annihilate premises contradictory to the tenets of neoclassical economic theory. A social blueprint that competes with free marketers' templates was hastily dismissed. Where capitalistic views reigned supreme, the imaginary link between the betterment of the poor and the commerce and trade crisis became a fact. Lumpen intellectuals enthusiastically endorsed corporate parasitic behaviors. They have fine-tuned the free-for-all slogan by muddling together monetarist amnesia and developmental schizophrenia with a dash of opportunist pragmatism. Money grubbing was elevated to the noble rank of a divine quest. Intimidation tactics were masked as economic policies. A heavy emphasis was given to the defense of property rights. Sputnik 1's echoes created new symbols and new jingles all over the world. Communists attacked capitalist creeds, indicting clerics and bourgeois for their lust for power and wealth. The surreptitious defenders of the established power structure were portrayed as gurus for their conniving response to social injustice. They presented the history of capitalism as one of exploitation and debauchery. Communities in which members put the means of production into collective decision-making structures should also be held responsible for the degree of deliberate slayings of large groups of people to amass minimum long-term profits. Communist stances led to a descent into contradictions under the real-world conditions of continual change. Karl Marx had, in a dialectical, materialistic way, admitted the necessity of the bourgeoisie's egoism for social progress. More than a century after the death of Marx, Trong Chin, a leader of the Communist Party in Vietnam, agreed with him. These concessions attribute a sense of benevolence to the capitalist animal spirit in an eerie way. Labor unions are nothing more than a capitalist ulnar hexadactyly. Capitalism did tremendously curtail the ancient power of worker confraternities on commerce and trade. Trade unions were the legacy of the guild sentiment by which the workers combated and lessened their exploitation. At first, they kicked the new machinery with sabots. Gradually, the workers came to realize the value of coalescing when bargaining with their employers to obtain a better rate for their muscles. At first glance, this expression of rational self-interest seems to have socialistic attributes. It turns out that the effort is in fact very capitalistic, an appendage of capitalism. Here comes Vishnugupta's central question. Of a rascal and a serpent, the serpent is the better of the two, for he strikes only at the time he is destined to kill, while the former at every step. The answer is never permanent. Pals who look for answers past science and common sense end up falling in love with fools and foolishness. Protesters talk about the social malaise without pointing out the rights and wrongs or what caused them. Souls sympathizing with communism should tour North Korea. Capitalists are becoming quite critical of the free market. Everywhere on this perplexing panorama, sages are in a long pursuit in the same direction to exterminate their ideological foes. The resistance's antiphons to maintain what is mostly a wall of privilege and tradition is chanted by oppressors as well as the oppressed. We fail to realize that capitalism and communism are in fact Siamese monstrosities, rejecting their respective premises without acknowledging the need for the meaning it provides. I don't think whether you believe in capitalism or you believe in communism or socialism, I think nobody can dispute that it is right to fight for a just and equal society. Ong Boon Hua. Conscious reasoning's process is not unique to Homo sapiens. Other creatures do hesitate before making a sound or doing something. There are few elements and compounds of which only humans are made. The ability to devise an excuse for a personal act of pure evil seems to be one of them. Why ordinary human beings conspire to organize themselves into trading other human beings is undoubtedly the most intriguing question we can ask. In the appraisal of a contentious social arrangement, dogmatism and condescension are anesthetizing. Nothing limits humans' pursuit of phenomena that are improbably well balanced. This is the principle behind lotteries, dating, and religion. Looking closely at our most fated fictitious triumphs, their metamorphosis seems unlikely for remembrance. The very first memories we have of our existence hardly sketched out the territory of the things we became fanatical about. Our investment in disputing what determines our viewpoints and made and unmade us neglects to address indispensable blunders and desperate paradoxes. Why haven't we become humans? Satanists are a lot more interested in what they see as community activisms and individual freedoms than in performing bizarre rites. The events that plagued the minds of Europeans in the 20th century facilitated communism, Nazism, fascism, nationalism, imperialism, and other reckless creeds to make their way across the globe. The very early miscarriages of social justice induced by the deities made Europe more vulnerable to devastating events. Moguls and monarchs hired conformists who exhibited a considerable degree of intellect or secret knowledge to violate natural laws. Socio-economic wrongs have been around for a very long time. Prior centuries' Übermenschen were shrewd analysts of these paradigm shifts, but awful forecasters of human emancipation. Their contentious ways of projecting the creation and existence crescendos tricked science and art concessions alike. But the flares of social dissensions were incited by slaves of different genders and ages who yearned to become men, with the machismo and ignorance that this entails. No one sought to become human. The universe hardly dispenses to skeptics an idea more effective than a psychosomatically buffed alibi. It is perhaps an act of mercy. I am tired of talk that comes to nothing. It makes my heart sick when I remember all the good words and all the broken promises. There has been too much talking by men who had no right to talk. Hinmatu Yarlatkekt. When Spanish colonists lashed out against Friar Bartolomé de las Casas for advocating the Native American right to freedom, he labeled the Negroes as a far better alternative for menial labor. The Catholic Church agreed. The history of the shitty hole from where I begun to lug my humanism has been one of grandiose repressions, exploitations, and civil wars. I have been entrenched in that reality since birth. My peregrination has been inundated with depressed zombies' rotten hands. These lenses help me notice different shapes and colors of socioeconomic injustices. I have no qualms about denouncing the nauseating culture that dehumanizes the deprived, raids a vulnerable social caste, or promotes coldness towards the destitute because I have been knocked out by poverty's ricochets, and not just once. The most ubiquitous challenge humanity faces is from scheming, non-exploitative human relationships alongside resource distribution and expansion symbiosis. Yoking peasants and the weak was for a long time in history the elite, God-given responsibility and duty of preserving social order. To meet their fiduciary obligation of funding their shareholders' obsessive opulence, conglomerates routinely slash the quality of goods and services to siphon the most money out of all of us. One has to tenaciously fight the urge to pile stacks of blame on moneyers, to sort out the tone of Socrates' paradoxes. The flood of chocolate bars in all shapes and forms at a Green Party's Congress peels off a noble intent from the members and contributors' gallantry. The gangs of social justice impersonators approach and proposition such, as co-ops are doing nothing more than diffusing real radical socioeconomic changes. There is an absolute consensus around the need for new social, commerce and trade and coherent political concepts. Cooperatives and cap and trade, or the refurbished community marketplace and means of transport as a new economy, and gentler strategies of stockpiling wealth are gaining momentum. These enthusing actions countersigning are pranks. The modern trope misstates how and why sane minds could act wantonly when it comes to enslaving other beings and to accumulating stuff. The symptoms are maladies manifested, not indicative of the disease's causes. The scapegoating of cheap goods and services and the proliferation of piggishness conceals the absolute magnitude of global social, commerce and trade and political fissures. The absence of intoxicating substitutes to ecumenical singing providing meaning to animate existence caused an existential dread. The terror of objecting to Deus Vult kept collective moral sense from adventuring on the other side of misery. The ridiculous fear of generating a philosophical vacuum overshadows the critical context of truth's exploration. We request a substitute before letting go of evil. Thomas Paine's ideological progenies, led by Lucifer, broke ranks with the self-determination campaigners and stormed the dungeon where God was held, and a pitched battle erupted. By the time it was over, they had freed the recidivists and beheaded the ideas of equality and human and civil rights. As a sign of gratitude, God aided the victors in the suppression of Allah's power over human bondage and provided ruses to prolong European moral decay. Make up your mind, snail. You are half inside your house and halfway out. Richard Nathaniel Wright. The decline of phobias inherited from past centuries is not the one causing bedlam in the Third World. The fundamentals of colonial economics involved exporting unprocessed raw materials and levying colonial taxes for the benefit of the metropolis. Local communities had no say in the extraction of resources. A skimpy investment was made into indigenous social welfare, such as an education fitted perfectly for a subhuman. Former European colonies ought to tip their hats to Germany, as it had been framed as the initiator of both giant clashes of civilizations. During the world wars of the 20th century, great European empires had to break all sorts of taboos, from racial to spiritual, for their national survival. They poured troops from their gardens onto the killing fields and ordered lower-grade races to kill white supermen. The psychological precursors of events are leading up to the vanguard of the oppressed audacious petitions for the right to self-govern. The masters who fought to retain their liberty, which provided the basis for the Western world, did not tolerate their colonies' demands for greater self-government using the same basis. Independence movements were met with severe repression, and some of their leaders even paid the extreme penalty at the gallows, while many were jailed. A rebellion is far from evidence of a vibrant, intelligent culture among the repressed. When former colonies gained control of the means to which they have not previously had access, they embraced the former masters' commerce and trade policies with little scrutiny. They climbed back up their huge curves into the same Victorian corsets. The adopted commercial system-based colonization's extrinsic notion of martial races and le race guerrière and social welfare generated what their politicians saw as a pile of unmarked funds, easy for them to misappropriate. Their freshly molded ruling classes awarded themselves the entitlement of a lifestyle underwritten by an extended set of variations of human bondage. The principle of wealth has to be gotten and preserved through septem peccata mortalia, but did not preclude some members of the elite from being victimized by the privilege they practiced. During the Cold War, new concepts could not flourish in non-aligned countries, even if the movement was filled by all the scholars of that time. Communism and socialism's morality stirred devotion of gullible Third World national heroes. It also increased the appetites of caimans. The nascent nation's elites, spitting out picturesque verses, were ominous signs of mental disquietude. Their head honcho submerged their megalomaniacal sense of their own destiny in guiding principles. Not long after, the relationship between the elite and the masses turned sour. A glimpse of non-aligned nations' rapacious attitudes towards harmless and kind-hearted souls, bathed in an ocean of delusional unconscientiousness, kept every dark corner of the world in the dark. Or should I be kind and say, at least in part, the inherent colonial brutality has led this bloc to another genre of never-ending social, commerce and trade, and political genocides. The dialogues among developing nations' leprechauns are framed by their narrow-minded insistence on traditional doctrines imported from the West. In these parts of the world, higher learning centers are regularly refilled with adherents of various orders, for whom philosophical sources are in isolation from their social contexts. The status of aficionado is solely granted through absolute obedience to racist sages from the better-off side of the globe. To conserve or to enhance this prestige, the Academy dons eagerly circulate outdated concepts and systems of belief, which are manufactured based on the colonial portrait of indigenous peoples as barbarians, alongside European efforts to seize native lands. The injustices deeply entrenched in their fallacious truth continue to be aired unabated throughout the 20th century. Foreign felons and conglomerates wielding great influence on a myopic and extremely rapacious gang calling the shots on wobbling nations' internal affairs is one sign of the indigenous off-center acuity. For homegrown moralists, it is one thing to be discounted in history by colonizers, but it is quite another when people with whom they have a great deal in common fail to consider their unflinching tone in local or global discourses. The message is that only Caucasians' verdicts count. Crusaders with the intention of saving shitty parts of the world rely on their privilege to devise social maneuvers. Do-gooders immerse themselves in sophisticated speculation about the origins of developing nations' despair, without acknowledging the agony in their own backyard. They are concerned with making and implementing injustices according to fair processes. Their view's lopsidedness is the result of the strong inclination of their minds to depreciate other cultures. Their ignorance of historical reality, particularly anything outside of a small geographical bubble which social justice movements claim to transform, is the most significant weakness of all. Even while losing legitimacy in the eyes and hearts of the growing legions of the disoriented, the free market is still managing to keep the whole predator-prey convention appear sustainable. We have all lost the pure taste of life's happiness. One could assume that the socio-economic symptoms exhibited make visible what needs to be done. There is a dark constellation of pretext faltering on social justice. We are still buying into roles assigned to social classes in the 18th century libretto, as if time intervals set the recurrence of experiences. The acquiescence of the capitalistic working class is inherited from the properties of mercantilisms, prejudice, and thraldom. Hustling day in and day out, yet still being rooted in poverty, causes wisdom's shrinkage and involuntary spasms of anger. Meditation would cool off the self-enslaved, but it is not a cure for the moral and physical condition. The social and political ecosystem does matter. The heterodoxy economics Maharishis and their disciples' failure to adequately address developed nations' losing streaks is making financial crisis a normal condition of global commerce and trade. The modern commerce and trade melodies are set to two esculent rhythms: continue patching capitalism and resuscitate communism. The first option is what we have now. Moneyers are leading us off the cliff. The second option of enduring waves of sadism is being snubbed, contested, and rejected. The world should be heading for the third option and thinking about something new. However, it is not. While in the Western Hemisphere Solons are pleasuring each other behind academic barrack walls, the rest of the world is avoiding facing the unpleasant truth. We ought to trash the whole system and try something new on our own. We do not know where to start. Writing isn't an easy taskmaster. Sentences left unfinished never continue as well as they had begun. New ideas bend the main arch of the text, and it never again sits perfectly true. Magda Szabo. Primitive scholasticism had the only unworldly excuse for phenomena. Almost without exception, motions were dictated by deities. Social constructs do turn passion into nothing more than a test of mores. Psychological contracts are to blame for the spillover of corrosive doctrines into the domain of wisdom, or for the intelligentsia's vileness. Distressed areas pump out sounds audible from a distance. Agony traps an entire society in a long period of irrational behaviors. When the right combination of organized noises and scallywags is added into the loop, dogmas take precedence to logic for diffusing blight and injustice. The aggregated memoir of humanity offers a fuzzy way out. Theoreticians make us all fall in love with extensions of rusty claims. Mantras crafted from turds have been shifting the jurisdiction of human fate between doctrines and mysticism. The initial stage and ambiance do not matter in grasping the nuance and tone of long-lasting rituals. A particular set of circumstances is required in order for reality to rend the vindictiveness from the intellectual. Most overconfident idealists' spin on the future of humanity is a condensed form of their eccentricity. Exceptional personages who possess paradigm-shifting flair have traditionally been part of revolutionary platforms. They make the most profound changes of the human condition, for better or worse, by observing attentively someone else's pain or joy, typically over a period of time. Some dissenters seem to have a series of lifetimes harassing society's cataleptic states of hypnotism. Their full commitment to awakening humans' inherent attributes, being responsible for the decisions made individually or as a herd, is praiseworthy. Was ist Aufklärung? This is the age of edgy inquiries, only on taboos that white men have opted to confront. The scientific achievements of the Victorian era glossed over the idea of a universe that was governed by physical laws and not by divine providence. Nature's myths were discredited, one after another, faster than ever before. Reasoning gained substantial grounds in the mind and spirit of the ordinary mortal. Impulsive novelists, critics, and poets scrubbed the baseline of what it means to be human. When it came to gender, slavery, and imperialism, nearly all of them delved deep into the supernatural to exonerate idiosyncrasies. Nothing worth heartburn was being concocted on injustice in other parts of the world around the same epoch. This is a grotesque claim. Other societies implanted slave-trading schemes centuries before European explorers, conquistadors, and missionaries arrived. Lector priests did not put Brobdingnagian effort into rationalizing the horrifying sybaritism that the elite enjoyed. Theories do not reveal the dynamics underlying this philosophic shift. The fundamental postulate of economics, that incentives influence human behavior, is not concerned with whether it is possible to assess the consequences of the verdict appropriately. Heterodox economists who attempt to raise rationality to the status of moral principle display flashing rhetoric. It takes time before they get wrapped up in their anger and completely flip out. When that happens, they go into screaming rages and continue to rant the same things over and over again. The malcontents' childish comportments embolden free marketers to prowl around like roaring beasts, looking for someone to devour. Fear-provoking radical ideas that threaten prime factors of social injustice with monotone variations end up having a little impact on the universe. Hang-ups will always fail to invalidate the kind of delicately calibrated misconceptions which had given economists prestige and purpose. Since the Industrial Revolution, one wrong, slavery, has been replaced, or at least matched by another: indigence. We are unanimous in demolishing poverty. When it comes to how to do it, the cultural acceptability of inequality is deemed as being necessary for all, to usher in a better course of human evolution. The desire of imposing a mechanism for a decent universal standard of living is so passé. Artificial traumas keep decent folks on the outskirts of bringing positive thoughts to life. The common substrate has remained the same throughout human history in disoriented minds. Political economy has become a sinkhole of thoughts and passion. Idiocy and prejudice hybrids feed on academia in some recursive, synthesized experiences. Each generation goes further in sophisticating the madness than the generations preceding it. Historically predominant radical voices would have gotten a better deal in history books if they did not grab some Z's, or resort to jumping in a hydrotherapy pool at the peak of their fury eruptions. Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the wise. Seek what they sought. Matsuo Chuemon Munafusa. Why don't current social, commerce and trade and political torments spring out dissensions in the laboring ranks, instead of a full-blown class conflict? Dangerous ambitions and fascinations brought the world as we know it into being very obscure. In Greek mythology, Sisyphus was sentenced for his deceits to roll a huge rock up a hill, only to watch it roll faster down the hill, to repeat this laborious and futile exploit for eternity. A debate about criteria for allocating compassion has irritated dreamers and truth-seekers since humans decided to be infinite. As the supernatural ceased to be the source of principles and criteria to determine how resources should be divided among people, superhuman beings sought to decrypt the complex forces that governed everyday lives. They speculated and contested whether principles such as need, equality, compensation, and contribution are independent of one another or could be combined. It is comforting to think of the influential theorists of the time as imposing figures staring sternly back at us. Their quixotic pursuit drove their bodies into poignant seclusion and their minds into overindulgences. We come to think of bravura as giving people the excuse to individually craft their meaning of life. It is hard for most to articulate, to express innermost feelings using the proper terms. Bringing bold ideas into the spotlight without trying to understand what sparked hallucinations in the context of space and time diffuses theorists' insecurities. And personal tragedies are completely ludicrous. But that is what my contemporary does all the time. A good listener pays attention to an interlocutor's words and demeanor, time and space, and his voice's variating tone to capture what people mean rather than say. The root cause of past indignations is still here with us, making the daunting objective achievable. Global melancholy offers us a reason and compassion exposes a way out. A coveted academic badge is the proper excuse to shut down empathy towards the less fortunate. Whereas some see themselves as heroes, for the masters, they are simply useful types. Even as we become more compassionate beings, individualism's ideological rewards keep our focus on self-examination. We do not see our shadows when we look at ourselves in the mirror. The cradle of our collective conscience lies in human fixations over ecstatically guesstimating imminent possibilities. This disposition confines thoughts to a place where it is hard to muster compassion for words. In the shadow of prejudices and humiliations, the reputation of neoclassical economics has somewhat declined. Real-world realities have been interfering in the orderly process of the entire economic field of recognition and anointment. Regimes no longer need to conjure up a divine right to be legitimate. Coherent concepts emerge without reference to God. The opium of the people, as Marx called religion, lost its potency through the widespread desire to better understand us, to work up vague approval for enlightening abnormality. We stubbornly extract from our incubuses the insatiated ideals to deepen the competence of our phantasms. Moreover, this mania is prolonged by the desire to immortalize every flare of brilliance. More than ever before, the northeastern hemisphere is today overdeveloped with primitive emotions, and the rest of the world is the opposite. Third world obsequiousness has continually reinforced the primacy of the free market. Depressive streets across the southern hemisphere have been portrayed as the consequence of grandiose despotism, exploitation, and civil wars. Western neoclassical practitioners have never been held accountable for the reforms shoved down dark countries' throats. These white men, women, and teenagers continue using former colonies as a testing ground for ideas that are too radical to be applied at home, contrary to the popular beliefs of modern tirailleurs Indochinois and tirailleurs Sénégalais. Socioeconomic expansion does not translate to peace. If we can learn something from World War I and World War II, African nation civil wars, commotions in each corner of the East, and racism, it's that peace succumbs to socioeconomic caprices or fiascos. The coral reefs bleaching, the Mara Salvatrucha campaigns of terror in the Northern Triangle, Abakua, and the Great Chinese Famine are all consequences of social, commerce and trade, and political scintillations flaws. What's the point of talking about saving the ecosystem without taking on social injustice? Solidarity wages approach the root of injustices in a very candid way. The association of the term anarchy with chaos has made the absence of authority our collective phobia. History shows that border walls keep only the poor apart, and trade agreements strengthen the grip of the rich on commerce and trade interfaces. Prior centuries' social, commerce and trade and political principles, like Marxists' catechism, in their theoretical frames have gotten part of the way. Considerable challenges must be faced in attempting to reconstruct plausible interpretations of long-standing systems of thought to remain cognizant of the dangers inherent in using current reality to understand old attitudes. Canvassers ought to take an inductive approach to stabbing deep into the capillaries of the current hidden state. By the mid-21st century, there was a renewed, growing, skeptical attitude towards capitalism's accepted premises. It was an incredibly fascinating time in history for the voyeurs and other mediocre beings who enjoy sudden gusts of human collective anguish. Distributive justice explorers, individuals, sought to alter the human experience positively and to stop conflating inequality and poverty. Then, capitalist propagandists incorporated the newest fables and the most up-to-date trickeries to prevent and mitigate ideological mutiny risks. The challenge for a prosecutor to convince cynics and the panicky jury was not in the closing argument's potency. Militants have been misled by other dogmas' emotional appeal and have lost the case for ending capitalism because of their premature urges. As we are all interconnected, dignity shouldn't lose significance. There has been a lot of economic and philosophical redundancy in the attempt to fabricate a substitute complementary to capitalism. Setting out to critique and to attack the current malaise achieves nothing good. When people are agonizing, they end up trying to organize noises instead of paying attention to the signal. This is when emotions take precedence over logic and disarticulate social justice's reasonable argument. Free market nemeses have been actively seeking to effect a critical shift. There is a small variation in voices railing against social, commerce and trade and political injustice. They have struggled with the question of wealth and injustice and continue to come up short. They do not bring anything new or of significance to the table, other than beautiful tables and colourful charts. Their misfires intensify the noises. The invalidation of emotions has only led to a fatal reassurance that all locks and bolts look alike at the right place. In a society in which Machiavellian methods to get rich or to tighten social order are regarded as assisting in the betterment of the only surviving species of the genus Homo, or a contribution to the Union, any real social justice experiment is doomed. Adventurers' continuous efforts to achieve intellectual honesty to bring a total revolution rather than just reform ought to dive into our collective unconscious. We have traded our need for a bunch of things for our want for a bunch of stuff. We sacrifice for our demise by stultifying the petition for a dignified life. Everything tastes like chicken, or, simply put, like nothing. We do not even remember what chicken tastes like. An anti-capitalism conviction cannot be overturned without acute eyesight. Social context does matter in grasping the nuance and tone of long-lasting traditions. The most critical and exploited resource in the 21st century is human creativity. It is, at the same time, extemporaneous and infinite. An unfinished sentence can be revitalized to cripple the spectre haunting the world.